Hey guys, and welcome back to the Political Lens podcast. Today we're going to talk about Minnesota and the Somalian refugees who have been caught up in this fraud case. So, without further ado, I'm going to get right into it. Minnesota has become the first point, one of the largest and most politically changed financial scandals in modern American history. Not because of a single crime, a single group, a single failure, but because it sits the intersection of emergency government spending, weak oversight, global migration, informal financial systems, and national security anxieties. Few policymakers were prepared to confront all at once. To understand what's happening now, you cannot start with terrorism and you cannot start with immigration. You must start with money, how it moves, and why some systems exist outside the formal structures most Americans take for granted. For decades, Somali immigrants in Minnesota have riled or informal money transfer systems, after referred to as hawala, not because they are secretive by nature, but because the formal banking infrastructure in Somalia either collapsed, neither existed, or is inaccessible to a large parts of the population. When families fled civil war, state collapse, and famine, they did not leave behind functioning banks or reliable wire systems, and yet survival still required money to move across the borders. Out of that necessity group, trust-based financial networks rooted in family ties, clan relationships, and local agents who balance accounts through reputation rather than contracts. In normal circumstances, these systems are not criminal enterprises, they are survival mechanisms. They fund food, healthcare, education, and the basic commerce in place where no ATM exists. They operate efficiently, cheaply, and quickly, which is why they persist even today. But the same qualities that make them effective for humanitarian use also make them difficult to regulate vulnerable exploitation. And when unprecedented amounts of taxpayer money flood poorly monitored programs, those vulnerabilities matter. All right. During the COVID 19 crisis, the United States unleashed a torrent of emergency spending such as it well intentioned. Much of it was rushed, and much of it inadequately safeguarded against fraud. Programs designed to feed children, house the vulnerable populations, and stabilize healthcare systems expanded to historic levels. Verification processes were weakened as well. And in Minnesota, as the federal prosecutors would later allege, organized fraud networks moved in to exploit the gaps. The Feeding Our Future scandal alone revealed hundreds of millions of dollars siphoned through fake food sites, inflated meal counts, shell companies, and forged invoices. Other programs included Medicaid housing service and autism care initiatives saw explosive growth followed by sudden collapse. Once scrutiny began, by the time investigators pieced together what had happened, the money was already gone. By the time of not misplaced, it was gone. This is where the investigation moves from domestic fraud to global complexity. Stealing money is one a crime. Moving it beyond reach is another. Federal investigators now say that some of the stolen funds may have been transferred overseas through money service businesses and informal networks tied to Somalia. The allegation alone was ignited a firestorm because it touches on fears that go far beyond fraud. Fears of terrorism, radicalization, and national security failures. Al Shabaab, an extremist group operating in Somalia, has long been known to exploit local economies by taxing businesses, extorting transport routes, and skimming financial activity and territories and controls. Now, Al Shabaab, I believe, is part of one of the terrorist plots that they took over the Taj Mahal and a hospital, I believe. over in I want to say India, but I'm not quite sure, so I don't want to say really. But they took over. It was a big plot, and they were all killed except one. The group does not need ideological donors to benefit financially. It benefits from geography, coercion, and weak governance. This is about Al Shabaab. They're talking about the reality creates a dangerous gray zone where the money that begins as legitimate aid, family support, and even stolen funds can be partially diverted without the sender's knowledge. But here is the critical distinction that must be made. Carefully and honestly, as of now, federal prosecutors have not proven in court that Minnesota's welfare fraud money directly financed terrorism. Investigations are ongoing, intelligence assessments are being evaluated, and political claims are circulating. But proof of the accusations are not the same thing. Now we're going to go deeper into the programs and the state government, like the Treasury and so forth, and talk about how this all happened. The Treasury Department's response reflects the uncertainty, rather banning informal remittance. Outright, federal agencies are expanding reporting requirements, increasing audits, and issuing geographic targeting orders aimed at high risk corridors. Uh, FinCEN, FINCEN, and the IRS are now deeply involved, attempting to trace transaction patterns, identity block transfers, and reconstruct financial flows after the fact. This is an extraordinary amount of work. Hawala systems do not operate like banks. They do not generate clean digital trails. They rely on defense settlements, offsetting obligations, and trust based enforcement. A single transaction may be recorded in a handwritten ledger, settled months later, and balanced against unrelated flows of money. This makes forensic reconstruction slow, imprecise, and often inconclusive. Yet regulators argue that ignoring these systems entirely is no longer acceptable in a world where billions can move across borders without any visibility. The challenge is how to impose transparency without destroying the access, and the challenge lies at the heart of the controversy. For Somali Americans, communities in Minnesota, the investigation has produced fear and anger and exhaustion. Many feel they are being judged not as individuals but as a collective suspects of support innocent families, not the criminal networks. Community leaders argue correctly that overwhelming majority of remittances support innocent families, not the criminals. They also warn of unintended consequences if legitimate money services businesses are shut down and overregulated. The remittances will not stop, they will simply move further underground. That would reduce the transparency, which would not increase it. Civil liberties advocates who echo the concerns, noting the financial surveillance without precision can quickly slide into profiling. At the same time, taxpayers and fraud victims demand accountability, and rightly so. Billions of dollars were stolen from the American citizens and the taxpayers. The state failed to protect the public funds. Now, the tensions between enforcement and equality, between security and survival, defines the moment. Politically, the issue has been weaponized. Some commentators frame Minnesota as proof of systemic corruption enabled by immigration policy, which also leads to Governor Walz, and that's a whole nother story with his corruption. Politically, the issue has been weaponized. Some commentators frame Minnesota as proof of systemic corruption enabled by the immigration policy and its leaders. Others dismiss terrorism concerns as a hysteria. Yet we have Somalian gang groups they got on camera attacking people. In one instance, there was a video of a white man being attacked by a group of Somalians. One walked up to the man and literally decked him in the face, started kicking him. Once they got him on the ground, a whole bunch of other people came in. I think there's like 15 of them on one. And it's a whole bunch of gangs, and along with the cartels and everything else that's came through the United States since Biden's open borders, they just It's really bad, worse than even most Americans even know. You can go to Google and type it right up, and it'll show you. Just type in gangs, Somali gangs in Minnesota, and it'll pop up, or it should. Oversight did fail. Duh. Oversight did fail, and formal financial systems can be abused, and extremist groups do exploit the economic weakness. All of these statements can be true at the same time. The question is not whether to act, but how. Experts increasingly argue that the reform must be layered and intelligent. Point of the money I'm sorry, and the response must be layered and intelligent. They propose strengthening oversight at the point of government spending, not just at the point of money transfer. They advocate for compliance support for the legitimate remittance operators rather than punitive shutdowns. They also emphasize cultural competence. The regulators who understand how these systems function as a practice are more effective than those who treat them as inherently criminal. There is growing support for developing transparent, low-cost digital remittance rails that preserve access while increasing traceability. But such solutions take time, investments, and trust. But such solutions take the trust that has been damaged by the scandal and the trust that must be rebuilt deliberately. The Minnesota investigation is still unfolding, and its final outcomes will depend on evidence, not rhetoric. If prosecutors uncover proof of stolen funds knowingly, finance terrorism, the consequences will be severe and very justified. If they do not learn their lessons, they'll be sobering. The absurdity invites exploitation, and that emergency governance without safeguards creates the opportunity for more abuse. Either way, this case will shape national policy and beyond. Minnesota, it will influence how the United States regulates informal finance overseas, as well as emergency spending and balance the security with humanitarian necessities. And that, I believe, is a must because we've been ripped off so much. In the end, this is not just a story about fraud or fear, it is a story about systems colliding. Modern bureaucracies colliding with ancient trust networks, emergency governance colliding with long term accountability, and the political narratives colliding with human reality. How this collusion is managed will determine whether justice restores confidence or deepens division. And until the investigations conclude, one truth remains unavoidable. When the money moves faster than oversight, shadows will always follow. Now, speaking of those that are involved in this scandal, we're going to go further with the criminal actors who are the only it's only one part of the picture, but equally important are the institutional leaders, state executive agency administrators, and the federal enforcers that occupy the space where the crime has occurred, which in this case, Governor Tim Walz sits at the center of the political storm. He's not a defendant in the criminal prosecution. He oversees the executive branch responsible for programs targeted by fraud, and he has therefore become a political face of accountability. Republican members of Congress and national commentators have publicly demanded answers from the administration, issued oversight letters, and asked for personal changes. Governors are accountable in the electoral and managerial sense. The public expects them to ensure strong internal controls, timely audits, and effective whistleblower protections. For Governor Walz, the legal risk is not criminality, it is political. The risk of sustained repudiation, damage, congressional investigations, and the electoral consequences if voters conclude that the state failed to protect them and their funds. This is a serious outcome of it in its own right. Political responsibility can end careers and reshape its policies. And also, Minnesota Attorney General is another consequential figure in the aftermath. The AG's office is responsible for the civil enforcement of certain criminal referrals and coordinating with federal prosecutors when state programs are involved. A vigorous AG can push for restitution, civil penalties, and structural reforms. A passive AG risks public criticism and the appearance of an like and the inaction like her usurping her duties. In this case, the Attorney General's office has brought charges in some Medicaid related abuses and cooperated with federal authorities in joint investigations. The office activity reduces political exposure but does not eliminate scrutiny about the adequacy and speed of the enforcement. The Attorney Generals do not face criminal jeopardy simply for failing to act quickly enough. Their exposure is judged in public in political terms and sometimes in civil oversight hearings, which of course, because no elites or nobody's held accountable. We know that, and that's what's effed up about everything. It's frustrating. Prosecutions is painstaking work. It requires forensic accounting, sealed subpoenas, wiretaps, paper trails when exist, and the patent assembly of admissible evidence. Where the prosecutors secure convictions, those convictions show internal, coordinated criminal behavior conspiracies. If defraud, the United States drives home just how methodical the organizers of these schemes were. The prosecutors have also alleged these laundered proceeds were moved through business entities and sometimes out of the country. Complicating recovery, those allegations were corroborated in court, which have led to significant criminal sentences and restitution orders where the facts remain in dispute. The allegations still inform regulatory action and public policy. Beyond prosecutors, the state executives and Treasury Department, FinCEN, and IRS have entered a fray. Treasury Secretary led steps to issue geographic targeting orders and require heightened reporting for money service businesses, which are regulated responses to a grander the responses are to a grander problem when hundreds of millions of dollars move through informal or minimal regulated channels. The financial system's capacity to detect suspicious patterns is limited. Those regulatory levers carry concrete consequences. They increase civil compliance obligations for businesses and raise the probability of civil penalties for licensed who fail to report suspicious activity and the channel information to law enforcement that can be used as a basis for criminal referrals. For community money service providers, those who can mean intense scrutiny, license reviews, and other closures if regulatory finds systemic violations. For political leaders, the steps can mean being drawn into disputes about fairness, discrimination, and proportionality, especially when the affected business is owned by the immigrant communities. Now, even if they traced all this money and they got the correct amount that they spent and the properties that they have bought or the cars they've bought or whatever, and they add it all up, we know we're not getting the money back. The immigrants ain't going to have the money. And that's why they shouldn't be in our country. They should be sent back to where they came from. The human dimensions of these crimes is stark. We are not only talking about abstract losses on spreadsheets, hundreds of millions of dollars siphoned from child nutrition programs, from Medicaid services, from housing stabilization payments. Those are the funds intended for kids' meals, for vulnerable adults, and therapies that help autistic children and other essential services. These scumbags got into like handicapped children funds, the food stamp fund, which we all know immigrants siphon off it when it's supposed to be for our vulnerable Americans. It's just disgusting. And of course, like I said, the higher ups, nobody will be accountable for it. And I'd be highly surprised if Trump got a conviction of at least one Democrat from Minnesota. That would surprise the shit out of me. Moreover, the scandal breaks a societal compact. Taxpayers who supported pandemic relief in good faith now feel betrayed. Well, no shit. I would be betrayed, wouldn't you? Vulnerable communities relied on certain programs, which will also cause them to lose credibility and face suspicion. Now, some of the severity of the crimes, let's talk about that real quick. Wire fraud and conspiracy charges carry significant penalties. they reflect the method of the intent of financial predators. The wire fraud requires the government to show the defendant devised a scheme to defraud and used interstate wire communications, the telephone, email, or electronic funds transfers to execute the scheme. Now, that I have questions about, as I'm sure many of you do. If these immigrants came from Somalia and they were refugees, they want to call themselves, how exactly does that work, and who teaches them or shows them how to basically play our companies? Like, here's how the loopholes that you can jump through to make it to where they got away with this shit. It's unbelievable. I just lost my page, so you're gonna have to give me a minute. I'm sorry. Sorry about this. Give me a minute. Uh, we're just gonna move forward, but basically, um, okay. So let's just jump to what should happen next. How should it be handled? And we're gonna talk about that real quick. And okay, so like I said, what should happen next? What should the prosecutors or whoever do? The lawyers, the governor, get off their ass to finally do their job. What should they do? Prosecutors must finish their work presenting evidence to the open court, pursuing all the viable leads. States and federal regulators must coordinate a plan to strengthen oversight and compliance support in the legitimate businesses. Community and civic leaders must engage in good faith dialogue to rebuild trust and create alternatives for safe, transparent remittance. And elect officials who accept responsibility where oversight failed, and which is what they don't have with Governor Walz, and legislate and reform necessary to close the gaps, which definitely should be priority number one. If you measure the severity of the crime by its impact on public good, then the Minnesota schemes are among the most consequential financial crimes of our day. They exploited noble intentions, targeted emergency programs meant for children and the vulnerable, and converted collective trust into private enrichment. The legal consequences for the criminals should be swift and just. The policy consequences for the state and federal apparatus should be thorough and long lasting. And the moral work of rebuilding trust must be entrusted by the community leaders and public servants who understand both the promise and the peril of remittance in a globalized world. That's why I'm so happy President Trump is getting rid of these scumbags. And I guarantee you, God, I'm itching for them to find something on Ilhan Omar. That woman should not be in our country and shouldn't even be on our Congress. And that's without saying. We need to remember this. The moment we are living through is not simply a case of study and small scale theft by picture of geopolitics. It is the collusion of both the intimate needs of immigrant families, the administrative weaknesses of emergency governance, and the predatory possibilities of organized fraud. How Minnesota and its leaders and its communities respond will be incentive for the entire uh, to keep the lifelines going. The scale of this was taken, who is responsible in court, and how leaders are now confronted with political and legal consequences. It's painful to say, but it is necessary. The severity of these crimes demands both retribution and reform. The former to hold individuals accountable for once in their freaking lifetimes, and the latter to ensure whole communities are not sacrificed on the altar of criminality. Minnesota story can be a turning point, a painful lesson, perhaps, but what leads to better rules, better enforcement, and more resilient public safety nets. If we fail to learn from it, the next theft will be easier and the next scandal will be worse. If we learn, we make the argument for a more just, more transparent system that protects both taxpayers and the most vulnerable among us. Thank you for listening. If you want, I can now convert